What do an old Dickensian shop, a chimp named George, and a dead cat have in common? Curiosity, of course. We're going to dive in and talk about the topic of curiosity and how important it is to learning with the most geeks we've ever had in this room before, a bunch of old friends. We're here on this episode of the Learning Geeks podcast, starting now. Hello, everybody. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to
Hello,
see everybody.
ladies. So, like I said, we want to jump right into this. We are going to talk today about curiosity. I will make one last comment is Jake and I might sound a little bit weird. We're actually in the same room looking at each other right now.
I don't know let me see if my computer will turn over, but
There you go.
There is Bob. Yeah.
So, I'm in Chicago now. Jake's in Chicago. This probably won't be the last time that we do this.
No, and we'll probably have a different setup too. It's funny, actually, in my bag, I have a whole setup that I was going to bring, but we did a tour of Bob's whole apartment complex, and so I didn't have time to set it up. So now we're sharing a mic.
We're sharing a mic.
Yeah,
it's all good. It's all good. But we are here to talk about curiosity, and I'm sure you're not curious about like my apartment building. So, Dana, I'm going to pass it off to you. Would you introduce our guests, and would you please kind of set up why we're here and what we're doing?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And I'm going to start with the context, and that will lead into a little bit about each of our guests. So usually when I'm out on a walk or a bike ride, I will listen to podcasts. But periodically, I will just say, you know what, silence today is going to be my friend. And so I'll just kind of reflect and think on different things. So New Year's Day, I was out for a walk, and I started thinking about curiosity. And I was thinking in particular about my grandkids and how they're just so naturally curious, and you got to protect them, right? You don't play with the stove and turn on the gas, and you don't do this, but that's totally fine. Give them a piece of paper and let them crumble it or whatever. Just they're curious about everything, and everything is new. And at that point, the brains are just developing so quickly. They're just so much input and so many things that are happening. And so I was toying with that idea, and I thought, okay, so as you grow older, what happens to that curiosity? A lot of it, I think, gets stifled. And then I started wondering about, well, what's the brain chemistry behind that, and what about its relationship to wellness, and what do we know about curiosity so that we could cultivate curiosity, not only in kids but also in grown-ups. So as I was thinking about this, three of our good friends from the podcast came to mind. Megan has done some tremendous research on the subject of awe and awe in everyday moments, and we've had her on the podcast talking about that. So I thought, well, she would be a good one to reach out to. And then I was thinking, well, what's the connection between wellness? And then, of course, Lauren comes to mind. And then with Jessica, she's my kind of go-to person on brain chemistry. So I sent off an email to all three of them posing a few questions, and it turned out to be a really fun banter for several weeks. We kept throwing ideas back and forth. And at one point we said, you know what, this is such good bantering about the topic of curiosity that we really need to have a podcast. And we thought about having...
Can we sum this introduction up by saying you got meta-curious?
Yes.
You were curious about curiosity.
I was.
Okay.
And cool. I was wondering how I could continue to be curious about curiosity.
Yeah.
So we invited all three, and I thought the way we would do this is maybe we would have, Megan, maybe we'll start with you giving just a little bit of your perspective on curiosity, and then we'll talk about that a little bit, and then maybe we'll go to Lauren, talk about that a little bit, and then Jessica. And I think at some point we're going to break because there's so many good ideas. We think we're going to probably do this into two podcasts. So we'll kind of watch the time, and when it seems like a logical break, we'll do that. And if we're not curious enough, then it'll be a very short podcast.
And for any of the new listeners that may have not heard, could you guys both all share a quick little intro as you go too, just so everyone knows who you are.
A couple of bullet points. So Megan, a couple of bullet points on who you are and what you do for fun, and then some of your background or ideas on curiosity.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. It's so good to be back and to be doing kind of a larger group discussion this time around. I'm Megan Cuzzolino. I'm the project director of the Next Level Lab, which is a research group at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We are focused on learning across the lifespan. We're a group of learning scientists, but a lot of our work is focused on learning for and at work. And so in my role at the lab, I am involved in a few different strands of research. And one of them that has led me to prior conversations with the Learning Geeks is about awe and the ways that we find moments of everyday awe in all aspects of our life. But a lot of my research has been focused on awe at work.
That's awe like amazement, not like awe.
Yes, AWE, which no matter how many times I use voice memo on my phone when I'm walking and thinking and talking, it has not yet picked up on the fact that that's what I mean.
So Megan, what are your thoughts about this subject of curiosity and its role in helping us to learn? What have you learned from the research you've done?
So you can get really in the weeds about the differences and similarities between the body or the group of emotions that we refer to as epistemic emotions, right? So the emotions that are involved in helping us learn. And awe is one of those emotions. Curiosity is one of those emotions. Wonder, surprise, some emotions that are maybe they don't feel so good, right? Like frustration that ends up leading to productive struggle and ultimately to learning. And so you could spend days or weeks or months reading articles where people are arguing about, no, this is what awe is, and that's actually wonder. No, that's curiosity, right? So it's unsettled in the literature how these emotions relate to each other. And the reason I think this is important is because a lot of the discrepancies have to do with the scope of the gap in our knowledge that we're trying to close, and also whether that gap is closable. And so there's a few different scenarios here, right? I'm a little bit curious because I heard about something that's unfamiliar to me. And so I'm going to go Google it or ask ChatGPT, and I got my answer and I'm not curious anymore, right? I don't have sustained interest. I've sort of satisfied my curiosity, check. Then there's that deeper sustained interest or curiosity. Some people would say it's not curious, it's actually interest if it's sustained, right? Others would say, no, it's a continued curiosity. I'm going to keep pursuing this. It's large enough in scope, it's complex enough that I can keep going back. There's more to dig into here. And then people start to talk about things like wonder and awe. And a lot of the argument there is whether this gap is closable at all. Right. So some people talk about awe as one of the main conditions for awe is the need for accommodation. So I can't fit what I'm experiencing into my existing mental model. I can't assimilate it. I have to accommodate and update my mental model in light of this new information. Other people say, no, awe is humility in the face of the unknowable. If you're kind of, doing that sort of scientific discovery where you're going to eventually close that gap, or at least, maybe humanity is, that's wonder, right? So people are very much arguing about the semantics in this, but I think it matters in the sense of, is it something we can quickly check the box? Yes, we satisfied our curiosity. Or are we going to keep going? And as we keep going, how confident are we that there's an answer out there, or at least an answer we can access? And of course, this also gets into questions of, scientific inquiry versus matters of faith or spirituality, right? So it's a complex world out there, lots to be curious about. And so I think the research that I do, I'm really interested in phenomena where that interest is sustained, right? Not just, done, but rather the well is deep. I'm going to keep going back to it. There's more here. There's a further path to go down. Dana, you shared such a great visual about what's around the bend. And that's the kind of curiosity or epistemic emotion I'm interested in.
Okay, questions
Megan,
for
if
Megan on that. Yeah, go ahead.
I do have a question. So it kind of stands to reason like awe would promote curiosity, but then if you keep going down that path of curiosity, you could lose your sense of awe. So the example that I'm thinking of is I'm going to get super geeky on y'all, but Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller, the magician, right? He likes to talk about how um, figuring out how a magician does his tricks is not what you're going for in going to a magic show. You're going there for that sense of awe or that sense of wonder. And I think what happens to a lot of people is they go to a magic show, they see something, they have this awe, wonder experience. Like, how did that work? Then they start getting curious about it. And then, if they go down the right paths, they can find out, they can learn. Usually they find out that it's a lot simpler than they thought it was. And when they do, their curiosity is satisfied, but their awe diminishes. Like, is that something that you would see, that it would kind of be like once you get to that sense of you've learned it, that the awe goes away?
Me, at least. So, in the research I've done, I've surveyed and interviewed hundreds of people, all in the context of the professions or of work, about their experiences of awe. And typically, the examples people come up with are examples of instances where I think if they experienced them again, the awe would persist. Now, if they experience them every day, it might not be awe anymore, but those aren't the examples they're given, even though I've just referred to everyday awe. But it really is that feeling of they're maintains something special enough about it. And maybe what is special is evolving, right? So the initial novelty might wear off, but there's something deeper that is continuing to be kind of just incomprehensible enough that it keeps you in that state. Scientists, I interviewed scientists about their experiences of awe back when I was doing my dissertation research. That's kind of how I got started down this path. And for them, they talked about awe as the source of motivation that kept them persisting in their work, right? So they think so much about being a scientist is super hard, but I have these moments of awe that keep me getting out of bed in the morning. And for them, it was so deeply intertwined with the moments of discovery and learning. These aha moments, either these conceptual understandings that they learned in a class or in a lab, or their own discoveries as scientists that were, even if it was something small, but this experiment worked, they learned something new and they felt awe. And they continued to have that experience often enough that it felt motivating for them to continue in this field. Now, when I interviewed other workers, especially we did a deep dive with folks who work in workforce development. So practitioners and others in workforce development organizations, their moments of awe were much more relational. And so they were about being in awe of the people they work with or the people they serve. And they were also about impact. So saying, I am in awe when I can see evidence that my work has made a difference in someone's life. And again, they might be experiencing that every time they go to their organization's graduation ceremony, every time an alum writes them a letter about how they changed their life, but it's continuing to kind of have that, generate that feeling of awe. And so I think there does need to be some novelty to it.
Yeah.
But I do think that even, if it's meaningful enough, if evocative enough emotionally, it can continue. I will say one last thing about this, which is that I think there's a developmental question in here that I don't have an answer to. But when I was starting to design my dissertation, Paul Harris, who is an esteemed faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a developmental psychologist, was on my committee. And I was thinking about studying children. And he said, can children experience awe, do you think? And I sort of said, what do you mean? They're experiencing awe like all the time. They do,
right? Yeah.
And he said, but then is it awe or have they not, everything's novel. And so if they're being wowed every time anything happens, is it awe or is it just being a kid? do you actually need some life experience? And we kind of went back and forth around that. And then it became a moot point because for other reasons, I ended up designing a study focused on adolescents and adults and not young children. And now that I have a young child of my own, I certainly think that I see her experiencing awe, which is different than just that general sense of being interested by everything that happens. But it's an interesting question, right? Of how much life experience do you need for context such that the novel experience can be deemed awe-worthy, or even, and maybe that's where kind of the general curiosity of a young child morphs into awe over time.
Yeah.
So Megan, where part of my question was around cultivating curiosity, I want to go back to the research you did with scientists. Science has lots of mundane things you do in order to get to some type of big revelation. What is it that pulls them through those times of mundane to get them to the, curiosity has to be part of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I wasn't asking them explicitly about curiosity. I was asking them about awe, but I think it's kind of on a spectrum, maybe. And I think those moments, those emotionally powerful moments, were really what was making them persist through the mundane tasks. In fact, at my dissertation defense, I had a whole slide that was quotes, quote after quote after quote, after people saying things like, there's so much drudgery that I don't know what you hang on to, if not for those moments of awe. And I also had a number of scientists who had left academia because the institutional pressures to publish a bunch of things really quick, to get funding, to do all the things you have to do to get tenure and stay in that profession, were actually preventing them from feeling awe. And they had left and gone into industry or policy or teaching, other fields where they didn't feel quite so constrained by those institutional disciplinary pressures. And so it felt very deeply embedded in the profession and their professional identity. That's like, I'm supposed to feel this sense of awe. And if I can't get it, something's wrong. Even though, yes, a lot of it's not that, right? A lot of it is your experiment didn't work, or you're in the lab all day on a Sunday because somebody's got to, keep the experiment running, whatever it is. It was that hope of once they caught the bug and had that experience once, they wanted it again. And the promise or hope of having that feeling again was what was keeping them going through all of those tedious tasks.
I do have a question for you, Megan. Actually, it's a two-part question. One is like, what do you think that primary difference is between awe and curiosity? Because I don't know that I'm holding it in my head the right way. I feel like awe is more about something grand and unknown, and more about wonder, like a state of being, and curiosity being more of a shorter gap in knowledge and almost like an action. And I don't know if I'm thinking about that right. And the analogy that I'm coming up with in my head, which I want to get your thoughts on, is the second part of this, which is I feel like it's the difference between how I think about purpose and meaning, where purpose to me is very much an end goal and something that is not something you would necessarily reach, where meaning is something that I can find in my everyday work and sort of attach in terms of shorter goals. And so I don't know if you've seen that in the research or if you just have a personal opinion about it, because it sounds like it's still a bit up in the air in terms of an agreed upon definition of all of these.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think I tend to agree with what you just laid out, that there's sort of a spectrum from curiosity that's a more localized, right? It's like, I'm going to feel that something has alerted me to a gap in my knowledge and I want to close that gap. And I think I can, and I'm going to do what I need to do to satisfy that curiosity, which may lead to some kind of sustained interest. Or I may say, got it, right? I figured out, or, maybe that wasn't as interesting as I thought it was, or wait, that's much more interesting. I want to go deeper. On the other end of that spectrum, I think awe is related to this sense of vastness, something that's kind of mysterious, that is maybe, outside of kind of what we think may be knowable. Maybe we can, we're not going to figure it out, but over time, over generations, the, scientific enterprise will answer it. Or in whatever domain, right? That it's definitely grander. And then But it also may be more of a, like, I feel that kind of low level awe here in New England when I walk down the street on a beautiful fall day and the sun is coming through the leaves and the foliage is, brilliant. I feel that kind of aesthetic awe. And I don't necessarily need to go study the science of how leaves change color, right? I can just sort of be in the presence of this beauty. And so I do think that in some ways, although awe fits within this category of epistemic emotions, there is often more of a, people are kind of satisfied to just live with that kind of ambiguity or sense of not knowing, right? To just be aware of like, wow, it's hard for me to comprehend how much beauty there is on our planet. And I'm okay with that. And I'm just going to appreciate it, right? And then I think wonder is somewhere maybe in the middle of these I can try to fill this gap in my knowledge, but maybe it's bigger. And actually I was just reading I think this has been laid out before, but there was a paper just recently, Francis Halligan, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's a Belgian scholar, and just published a paper recently that was about these three terms, and kind of spelling out the differences in much this way. And I think to the other question about meaning and purpose, this is something we've been thinking about a lot because actually we see a very strong association between awe and meaning, and the ways that awe helps us construct these broader narratives in which we're situated. So it helps us feel part of something larger than ourselves, and it anchors us to this larger story that gives us a sense of meaning. And in the literature on meaning in life, and we've also been looking at it specifically meaning in work, there's the typical model has three subconstructs that are part of meaning. And one of them is purpose. I have this sense of direction. Another is comprehension or coherence. Like my life hangs together. It makes sense. And the third is mattering or significance. Like I matter in the world or in this whatever context. And so the theory holds that when we have a sense of meaning in our lives, all three of these feelings are present, and that a sense of awe can facilitate these feelings. And so we did some secondary analysis of data that we had that was actually asking this. We were thinking at, okay, in people's narratives of their awe experiences at work, do we see evidence of these different subconstructs of meaning? And the short answer is yes, we absolutely do. In almost every description of awe that people presented to us, there was at least one facet, if not more, of these elements of meaning.
One thing I was thinking, Megan, as you're talking, and I know Dana and myself and Bob can relate, but in the role of innovation within an organization, I think that in my role, one thing I'm constantly inspired to do and where I feel my purpose is always to seek a new question that hasn't been that hasn't been answered yet, and to discover. So it's almost like the scientist role, right? But I feel like that is my purpose. And so in some way, I never really thought of it this way, but I look for those moments of awe of like, oh my gosh, that is the question. That's the thing that we've never have asked before or never looked into, never researched or never experimented with. But I'm having this realization as of right now of realizing that that is one of my purposes. I've kind of a part of my role, a part of being an innovation.
Jake, as you were talking, we haven't done any pop culture stuff, right? I've been binge watching Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And when you're talking about discovering new things, I was thinking, new life and new civilizations, right? Going
boldly.
Mm-hmm.
Going boldly.
Are you allowed to put a Star Trek reference in here?
Yes, we're not those
Star
type of people. We're not gatekeepers.
Just checking. Okay.
Well, we had the debate a while back over which was better, Star Trek or Star Wars, and I kind of waffle back and forth. And I currently am on the Star Trek bandwagon. So
my dad will be so happy to hear that when he listens to this. He's a Trekkie. Thanks for that.
We don't have to choose. That's the way I look at it. We don't have to choose. We're adults. We can enjoy everything. So. Should we get Lauren's perspective? Do you want to jump over to Lauren? Yeah,
let's do that. So, Lauren, what are you thinking about curiosity?
Did you still want me to intro myself?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Who are you? By the way, who are you?
Who am I?
How'd you get on this podcast?
This awe and wonder
how's Florida?
Florida is beautiful. I won't rub it in if anyone's not having good weather, but we're having a great spring break here. And I don't know, I feel like I've been on the Learning Geeks a few times now. I
Yeah.
can't
You have,
remember. But I've been a human performance sciences researcher for quite some time and also a background in learning sciences. And so actually came to know all of you through Dana when we worked on some work together at the Institute for Applied Learning Sciences at Accenture, where we were kind of examining the relationship between well-being and learning. And that was just such a fun time. I loved it so much. And now I run a learning and leadership development firm that focuses on human performance. So I guess that's a summary of me. I have a couple of teenage boys. I'll probably hear about them later in the podcast because we're talking about curiosity. But other than that, my thoughts on curiosity, I was trying to think of this in really highly applicable terms. And, the way I think about it is curiosity is like an aperture, like the practice of widening an aperture, which is something I would want for myself and my teenagers and my clients who are mostly in leadership positions to learn to flex the muscle of aperture widening, particularly when it comes to high stress situations or being under pressure, which is what a lot of us are facing these days, especially. What I mean by aperture is I think that and Jessica can probably explain this in a much, much more detailed fashion than me, but we are essentially innately wired to see danger and what's wrong. That's just how we're wired. We tend to look at the negative over the positive. And so biology in a way works against us, particularly in moments of stress in particular. And in those moments, our aperture gets really narrow. So it's really hard for us to see what's possible, what else could be true. And I think this impacts our ability to see other possibilities, other perspectives, and to learn. And for me, especially, I think a lot of our default stress patterns start to come out. So beliefs about ourselves that could be limited, et cetera. And then add to that, I think most of us live and operate in a really narrow social worlds too. In my personal opinion, our public school system, for example, where you live, social media usually reflects people like us, what we think, what we believe, and maybe if you're in a leadership position, for example, the higher you climb in your role, the less real feedback you get. And so our aperture, again, when faced with situations that are high pressure, high stress, could be really limited to our own worldview, our own beliefs, our own thoughts, etc. Very limited view. So then we start to develop these stories to explain or interpret what happens to us, how we feel about ourselves, and so on and so forth. Narrow aperture. Curiosity to me is the antidote to that. It forces us to shift our brain activity from these fear-based thoughts, mindsets, behaviors, actions, etc., to this more exploration mode where we're more thinking in opportunistic perspectives or thoughts, thinking, Dweck's work on growth mindset here, for example. So with time, we can start to shift to a default that looks at challenges like opportunities, not insurmountable threats, helping us close gaps in knowledge, be more innovative, be more creative, be more solution oriented. I think the official term would probably be called, and the ladies can check me on this, cognitive reappraisal. But I also think that there is a link between curious people and I think there is a link between curious people and better emotional regulation, better quality of life, longevity, better relationships overall, even resilience, and even courage. And I mentioned this on some email exchanges, but I really love the way that Brene Brown refers to curiosity. She calls it an irreducible, I'm giving bunny ears here when I say that, irreducible component of courage, which I really love the way that's phrased. So to me, the way she's looking at it is curiosity is courage in action. And I love that. I love that thought. And of course, to me, I think all of this applies directly to leaders or any of us trying to build this muscle of widening the aperture, whether we're managing direct reports through a major change, which is happening a lot lately in the workforce, managing our limiting mindsets. I think it's just such a power skill. And Jake, you were talking about innovation earlier, and I think that innovation and curiosity, I agree with you, they go hand in hand, but also it's really hard to get in a space like that when we're in high stress moments. So, I could take us on a long tangent here, but I do think that where curiosity and innovation and creativity live in the brain, that default mode network, it's a place that we have to be intentional about building in to the way that we go about our days too. So curiosity in terms of looking at this from a day-to-day or systems approach, how are we building in space in our day to practice this is another way we could take this conversation. But I probably want to pause there and get everyone's thoughts on the idea of it being this kind of power skill and this aperture widening leadership skill.
I love it. I've been talking a lot to people who are kind of new to even the idea of learning science lately about why it works. And we've been talking about all of the different brain chemicals and the impact they have on learning. And the idea that, a little bit of cortisol can help motivate learning, but too much is going to bring out the amygdala hijack and the flight and fight and flee, and you're not going to learn anything. So, it's easy to say we as learning designers need to make sure you get just the right amount of cortisol in there, but like that's a really hard thing to do. And especially unless it's a one-to-one situation, right? Like what might not cause Jake any stress is sending Dana through the roof. So tapping
Because I
people
do that
into
all
that
the time.
I know, right? It happens all
Yeah.
the time. But tapping people into that idea I love the idea of curiosity being the antidote to that narrowing focus.
Yeah.
If we can get people on top of that as they enter a learning experience, then they're able to keep that cortisol down and they're able to learn more.
I was just going to say, I think, Bob, you were alluding to some of the work we did on training stress and allostatic load, right?
Yeah.
And curiosity can be energizing and promoted when training stress is in the appropriate place, but you don't know someone else's allostatic load that could change day to day. And so, yeah, how do you lead through that? That's really tough.
No, I could tell you, like, back to the innovation front, one of the techniques I always would tell anybody who's new to this space is to, when you see a problem, even if it's stressful to you in terms of you're thinking of the negative thoughts of what this new technology can do and so forth, it's very easy to think of the negative side, but instead, how do you reframe things as opportunities? And I know personally, I had to take my own medicine back in 2023 or 2024, when Gen AI was really, or like announced, at least to the public. It was around, but I remember personally having a really hard time with it. And I was going down the spiral approach and thinking in a very narrowed mindset of all of the negative sides of it, rather than reframing it as opportunities, what types of new questions exist in there. And I do remember how hard it is and how stressful it was at that point. And I mean, I think at one point we talked about this on our episode, where there was a moment where I had the natural thought, I'm losing my job, I'm not going to be here anymore, and blah, 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 blah. But I had to remind myself back and to open up the door to be curious about this, jump into it, learn as much as you can about it. And then from there, I can find probably the light and figure out what could be good coming out of it.
I was just going to say, it takes a lot of discipline, and also I think workload factors into that, Jake, too. It's hard to be curious and think in that kind of opportunistic growth mindset way when workload is really high, and then you're trying to learn this new skill like Gen AI when it was first emerging. And I mean, not to go down that rabbit hole, but the whole, building space for practicing curiosity too is another, way we could go with this conversation, is what that rhythm looks like in your day, which we've talked about on the podcast before. But really hard to be curious and innovative and pause in a moment of, uncertainty like that when you're cognitively overloaded, for example.
And I would say real quick on that front, like, I realize that even when I say this, back to Bob's point, like, our job is to be curious. Like, I know in my position I'm being curious, but I know that there's people that's not their job. Their job has other things. They have other things to do. They're pressured. They have other pressures. There are other people telling them they have to do this task. And I know that there's folks that are just worried about that, the threat of coming across badly to that individual or to their value at the organization. So I guess for the listeners, I know that I come in a place where I could say that. It's easy for me to say that, but I also know that I'm in that position too. That is my job, is to be curious. And I know it's not as easy for everyone to do that.
Well, hey, you know what I'm really glad about? I am super
What's that?
glad. I'm super glad that we decided up front that this was going to be a two-parter because we are probably pretty much at the end of the time for our first part.
We-
Yeah. Oh, jeez.
Yeah, we sure are.
How's that?
Time flies
probably
when you're
are.
having fun. And we have hardly heard from JB at all. So here's what's going to happen is through the magic of podcasting, we'll be back in 2 weeks with part 2 of this discussion. But secret on the inside, because I know you're curious about how we do this, we're going to take about a 2-minute break and then we're going to go and we're going to record the second one again right now. All right. So listeners, I'm going to invite you to come back in 2 weeks. Get curious about everything that you've been hearing and what you can do to apply it and think about that and reflect on it because we know that's good for learning. Come back in 2 weeks. We'll wrap up the conversation. For all of my guests here today and my co-hosts, thank you so much for being here. This was fantastic. And I look forward to another one next week. So we'll see you all on the next episode
Thanks,
of Learning Geeks
everybody.
Podcast.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.